During this discussion, we will try to find out whether this axis actually exists, the Iran-Russia-China axis. Is this axis an effective one, and has it already been formed? And we here in Israel will also try to see what are the implications of this axis on us here in Israel. Since the war in Ukraine began, and after the severe condemnations by the West and all the unprecedented sanctions imposed on Russia, Russia has in fact been pushed into Iran's open arms. And the two countries, these two countries that have been outcast, have forged an alliance between them. And we are now seeing the relations between these two countries, and there's a long history of relations between these two countries. Russia, of course, has also gone toward China. China is also in a relationship, a special relationship with Russia. In this current geopolitical situation, we can certainly see a trend of closeness between these three countries, and we can certainly identify the formation of this new axis: Iran, Russia, and China. I think that we will be seeing in the upcoming months changes, certainly in the global arena, and this axis will perhaps play a role. And I want to mention another fact that is important in order to understand the axis that is forming. I will talk about the joint maritime maneuvers that were carried out, the exercises carried out in September. And not only this maritime exercise, it was not the only one or the first, it was the third actually in the history of the relations between these two countries. Assaf, I would like to ask you, do you really see this axis forming? And if so, is it really an effective one? And what do they think in China? How do they perceive, and what are the implications for the global arena? Good morning, and thank you for inviting me. From a Chinese perspective, even though we would be tempted to think of relationships as axes and camps and alliances, there is a wide range of partnerships based on shared interests. China is looking for a way to inform the world, to design it so that it would have an advantage, because the current order, in its view, formed after the Second World War, is an order that is in favor of the United States, because it was behind it, and it reflects the balance of power that was true for the end of the Second World War. And these days, when China has developed, has become stronger, and has grown, it believes it should play a bigger role, it should be seated closer to the table, and that the rules of the new order should serve it better. And therefore, when it looks at Russia and Iran, each of which it looks at differently, by the way, it sees partners in the desire to change the world order, to reduce the might and role played by the West and the United States, and the desire to fence any external interference in its own internal affairs. Don't interfere in Iranian matters, don't interfere in Russian matters, that's what it means. And Russia and Ukraine we will not talk about right now, but from China's and Iran's perspective, in terms of the Middle East, China has a relationship with Iran that is an overall comprehensive strategic partnership, which is, by the way, not a ladder. It's this kind of space of definitions and relations. So it has this relationship with Saudi Arabia and also with the UAE and probably Iraq, if I'm not mistaken. It sees Iran as a serious nation with a lot of energy, and China is a big consumer of energy. Iran is placed well en route to Europe and Asia. It also objects to the United States in the Middle East. It is forcing the United States to play a part in the Middle East, and it's also making it harder for the United States to take a step away from the Middle East and to turn to the Indo-Pacific and East Asia, which is the main arena where China and the United States are fighting. So these three reasons mean that China is kind of balancing out American clout by creating this kind of weak camp. I would not be looking at this boundaryless partnership in the Winter Olympics, and on February 24th we already found out that there are boundaries and there are limitations, especially when Russia was not proving itself as an organization or a country that is really living up to its promises. So I think that we should, here in Israel, look at what the system means. So I would wrap up and say that not an alliance, it's a partnership, a specific partnership based on specific shared interests, and it also has some formal aspects. The Shanghai Cooperation organization, that this summer a draft of an agreement, a Chinese-Iranian agreement, was published, and there was a wave of publications about how China will now become Iran's ally. Well, China doesn't have allies in the same sense that we understand allies, and the amounts, $400 million in 25 years for investments, mostly in the oil market and developing oil fields in Iran. We don't see the money flowing at the same rate that they should be. And therefore, the main approach should be to see what really is happening, what's happening on the ground. And even when you look at that, some of these things should be of concern to Israel. This military maritime collaboration is one of them. The agreement included military collaboration, and a commitment to do that, to collaborate on arms, on cyber, on intelligence. All of these are areas that at the end of the day mean that the things that China knows can actually move on to Iran and be passed on to Iran. So even if we don't see China protecting Iran, if we don't see China protecting Iran properly. Okay, so we'll be talking about the conflict of interest and the disagreements between these three countries, and we will keep going. But there are tensions, right? Yes, there are tensions. We will certainly talk about those as well. Daniel, now I'd like to ask you, because the party that is really putting this whole axis together is Russia, and they are collaborating with Iran in all areas, military, economic, even cultural. If you don't know, the Minister of Culture from Russia traveled to Iran to sign an agreement, and suddenly many Russian tourists began to arrive in Iran, which sounds a bit strange, but it's a fact. And without a doubt, Russian delegations are learning from Iranian business people how to circumvent the sanctions, and there's a lot of talk about that, and we must also pay attention to that in the Israeli context as well. They have even agreed that the kind of when they do transactions, they will use local currency, rubles, or the Persian currency. And let's jump onto what we are very concerned about. 2 days ago, in one of the American publications, we heard that there is an agreement to build a factory for the manufacturing of drones in Russia, Iranian drones in Russia, which is of course of great concern to us. So please tell us how you see this development and what the implications are for us, for Israel, but we'll be talking about those areas as well. Thank you very much for inviting me. I will give you a kind of mirror image of what Assaf Orion has said. Alexander III, the Tsar, gave us a quote whereby Russia has no allies except the Russian army and the Russian navy, and in recent years it's also the Russian Air Force. So Russia doesn't believe in alliances, the kind of alliances like NATO or the alliance that Israel has with the United States, but only meetings of interests. And Russia only views itself as a superpower, as a great power. It doesn't view itself as too committed. And even the countries that are formally in an alliance relationship with it, like the Central Asian countries, we saw in recent years that it doesn't hurry to come to its side when they ask for help. So when it comes to Russia and China, I wouldn't call it an axis. I would say that there is a growing point of meeting of interests. Russia finds itself more and more isolated. It needs to find new friends, new partners, and when it detaches its economy from the global one, it needs to find alternatives. And here China and the third world countries are coming to its aid, and Iran is a key player for it on various levels. So on the military level that you started with, I think that that's really the main difference, because the relations between Russia and China have been developing since 2015, when Russia went into Syria in order to organize together with the Assad's regime to help it. And for a while they fought together on Syrian soil, with Iran of course, not with China. And as part of this present war, as far as President Putin, it's the war of his life. It's one of a historical proportion that will determine what kind of role Russia will be playing in the world. So Iran is giving Russia what no other country, player, is willing to give, at a place where Russia has neglected a certain area, and that is the precise missiles area. Wherever they have precise missiles, they are very expensive. They don't have enough of them, and Iran knows how to give Russia to provide it with a solution of hundreds, perhaps maybe later thousands, of munitions that we see in Ukraine. We heard from intelligence briefs that there are also precise missiles on the way, and also the manufacturing line, the production line. So we spoke during the break about whether this is something that is actually implementable, that they will have a manufacturing line, a production line in Russia. Well, it has some complexities attached to it. But at the same time, once two manufacturers are collaborating, and the Russians know how to manufacture missiles, and the Iranians can do it en masse, they make big quantities of it, and they know how to do it. And I think it's something that is possible. I'm not saying that we can't do anything to stop this scenario, but in terms of having this kind of production line in place in Russia, we cannot underestimate the possibility that this will actually happen. And in the last panel, they talked about how the Iranians have a security enterprise that is very similar to other countries. And I also want to add another point, and that is on the economic level. Russia should now take, until a year ago, their main commercial partner was the EU, but now Russia needs to find a replacement for the EU. So China is far away, and to build logistic systems going all the way to China is too expensive. And China also has a lot of bargaining power, which is why Russia is finding it hard to make a profit. If Russia sells to China, it will be a very competitive price. Iran, in this respect, its relations with Russia are more balanced, and Russia is now at a point where it is trying to build transportation corridors through the Caspian Sea from Russia to Iran, and this is very important. And that's why the relations or the economies between the two countries, and maybe until a year ago, if you'd ask what it was, I'd say they'd compete one another, because they are both suppliers of energy. Now suddenly they're collaborating more. Well, I must admit, though, that the Russians have already managed to sell Chinese some of the oil that the Iranians used to sell to them. Yes, it's a matter of price. As far as China is concerned, they can buy from Iran, they can buy from Russia, they have no sentiments as for that. Okay, Jonathan. I will now speak to you and ask you, of course, in the United States and in Europe, everyone is following this alliance, especially between Russia and Iran. And of course, I'm assuming, I believe, that the United States is not encouraging or is not happy with China joining this axis, even though we have doubts whether there is an axis, but let's call it a partnership. And of course, here too, they are following every single step and action taken. And I would like to ask you, the last meeting between President Biden and President Xi, did it change anything? Did the concerns alleviate? Or are we certainly looking at certain American reactions to what is happening?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Is the microphone working? It's okay. I think the Biden-Xi meeting was, of course, quite significant. It was expected to produce some results, mainly to change the atmosphere in the relationship, because the relationship between China and the U.S. had been going downhill for several years. And I think now that both sides have decided they've gone far enough toward tensions. It was time to restore the balance. Why is this relationship different than the U.S. relationship with Russia and Iran? You have to look at what China is about. China is not trying to destabilize the world. It's not trying to destabilize the Middle East. It's not trying to destabilize Europe. China wants to continue to leverage the existing system, the global system, because it's growing quite rapidly within the system. Its economy is growing, and eventually it will dominate the system. But if it upsets the system, then it won't work so well. And China is primarily dependent on Western consumers. And so China needs United States consumers to buy their goods. So I think that the China-U.S. relationship is going to be, it's hit the bottom for a while. And I think the Taiwan issue we can talk later, but that's been put back on the back burner for the time being. Now, Russia. I think the Russia story is a good news, bad news story. The Russia story invading Ukraine is a good news story in that it exposed, deterrence works when you don't have to use it, when you don't have to go to war. But once you go to war, your deterrence may not be so great. And that's exactly what happened. What Russia has proved to be much weaker than expected. And I think that means that it's an advantage to Russia's adversaries, and it's an alarming to Russia's allies. Russia's problems in Ukraine have weakened not only Russia, but they weakened China and Iran, because China looked to Russia to sort of balance as a balancer against Europe and the United States, and Russia's value is devalued in that alliance. And with respect to Iran, I think Iran has a very close and long-standing relationship with Russia, and if Russia's arms are devalued, if they're not performing, their military is not performing, it sort of questions the value of what Iran's been getting from Russia. I don't want to overstate that, because in the previous two sessions, particularly the last one, we've learned about certain operational challenges that both the U.S. and Europe, and I would say also Israel, face. I think we're all three in the same boat here. And these operating challenges are specifically what Danny was talking about, the new introduction of drones, and now tomorrow ballistic missiles, and the espionage and the cyber capabilities of Iran, and the partnership. I mean, some people have gone so far as to say that for the first time since the Shah, the Iranians have a superpower patron. Now, Khomeini, the one who succeeded the Shah, may be not so happy, because his great gift to the Iranian Revolution was, we will be neither with the East nor the West. We will be non-aligned. And that doesn't seem to be true anymore. So what Khomeini wanted was for the Iranians not to be in anybody's hands. And that's a danger for Iran, to be too close to either China, which has so much leverage, or too close to Russia. But, the bottom line is that some people feel that Russia can be a superpower patron. They're still a superpower, even though they can't win a war in Ukraine. They still have a lot of other things that make them a superpower. And with that kind of patronage, Iran can now punch above its weight. So there are some concerning operational challenges. But to sum it up, I say that the strategic benefits to Europe and to the U.S. outweigh the tactical and operating challenges, because we've seen the United States and Israel overcome these challenges in the past.
I will go back, to the many conflicting interests between these three countries, because I think that this is a very important point. Based on this premise, do we see some kind of a situation-based alliance, or is it indeed an alliance that's being formed, and we will see this axis, Iran, China, Russia, in the new global order as some kind of bloc? Assaf. Well, it's very tempting. As we're talking, we also keep repeating these words, alliance. Guys, partnership. They're doing business, serving interests together, coordinating their positions on certain things. Well, definitely there is an agenda to tell that democracy is not the solution, that there are authoritarian solutions that work brilliantly. Look at us. It works. It's great. So there's this partnership. Who's us? Who's look at us? We, China, Russia, and Iran. We, the authoritarian countries. You, with the democracies. You're on the decline since 2008. The West, that's the story that China is telling. The West has been declining and Asia is rising. The economic growth data supports that. For the Communist Party, they have so many achievements to show. Look how many people we've managed to lift out of poverty. Our model can work for others as well, even if they're not Chinese. We're not going to export the revolution as Chinese, but there are also tensions. When we look at China and its interests in the Middle East, China is the largest consumer of energy in the world because of the size of its economy, its population, etc. The Middle East is one of the main suppliers, and Russia and Iran are also suppliers for China. One of the things that China always prefers to do is to diversify its sources, to make sure that it doesn't just depend on one vendor, that there's a competition between Iran and China on prices as exporters. For China, that's an advantage. When there are sanctions imposed on Iran, if they can somehow be bypassed without exposing themselves to risk, why not fill up their oil reserves? And if we don't want to get involved in this, be under the danger of sanctions, they can park on the sea these containers. And even Britain, we discovered, we heard yesterday that Britain was receiving Russian oil in such a way, and over 700 million, it paid over 700 million pounds for this oil. It's Russian oil, and they're not allowed to buy it anymore. And there's this transfer station, a Turkish station that turns it into, so to speak, kosher, legitimate oil. But energy always finds its own paths. Looking at China, China wants stability in energy supply. That's one of the things it needs. It needs uninterrupted logistics between the raw materials that are outside and the plants, the factories that are inside, and the markets that are out of China. Also inside. It's not just the American market that's important to them. China is trying to have a double circulation now. Trade and services inside China as well, so that not all of its growth will be based on export. Now, the Middle East is in the middle of the way geographically, so they need some peace and quiet on the maritime routes. We don't want the oil infrastructure to be threatened. So what do you do when one day in the spring of 2019, Iran, their strategic partner, starts attacking the infrastructure of their strategic partner, Saudi Arabia, or when the Houthis, as Iranian proxies, are attacking backing the Emirates, and the Emirates are also a big strategic partner of China. Do we see China saying something publicly except for calling upon both sides to show restraint? And it definitely undermines the interest. But do we see China curbing Iran in what Iran is doing there? No. Do we see it supplying public goods, quote unquote, of regional security? No. It is managing this by taking half a step back and knowing that somehow with the economies of scale, it'll work out at the end. So there is a tension. I don't think that China wants to see nuclear Iran. This is why we see it involved in the previous JCPOA processes, and it's also supporting the efforts to reinstate from the outside. It's supporting. But we need to remember that the uranium facility in Isfahan was supplied by China. There was Chinese nuclear supply to the Iranian nuclear program at the beginning. China is selling weapon systems to Iran, and Iran manufactures from it its own models. Some of these missiles is then launched at the Israeli fleet and strike the Khanit Israeli ship, and they're launched from Yemen on the vessels of the American fleet, C-802, or the Iranian model. So China, on the one hand, wants stability, but on the other hand, it is also doing some of the things it does don't really encourage stability. Let me make it more difficult. Let's add the American layer. There's American pressure on the Chinese, and the Chinese don't want to spoil their relations with the Americans. You need to add that as well. I define the competition with the U.S. as a common element to all these three entities at the beginning. I wouldn't say that it doesn't want to hurt its relations with the Americans. I wouldn't say that, but it just wants to use or exploit these relations as much as possible without damaging it. It is benefiting from the current international system, but it also wants to make sure that it has people in the right positions. They want the Chinese to set standards. They want the patents to be Chinese, that the communications infrastructure will be Chinese, for the manufacturers to be Chinese, the roads that Russia doesn't know how to pave. It's not only roads that they don't know how to build, but trains and roads and the communications in Russia. I was amazed to hear that Russia agreed to operate Huawei in Russia. They know what is done with these systems. The Russians built a speedy train from Moscow to Kazan, which is 800 meters from Moscow to St. Petersburg. I think that he meant the Chinese. They've taken over. No, they didn't take over. It's theirs. They are the strongest entity in Asia. And whenever people allow them to build, they build. That's the economy of scale. It has, on its, China has the economy of scale on its side. So there are tensions. Russia and China, this is allegedly called a limitless partnership, but there's one limitation. They don't like each other. There's a very interesting discussion about the impact in Central Asia. I don't think that Russia is very pleased with China becoming a country that, other countries are looking up to from Central Asia. There are border conflicts that have been frozen, where China was the weaker side. And in eastern Russia, there is a growing Chinese minority. Chinese minorities are always the size of a medium-sized European country. I must disagree, because since the invasion, since the drop in recent months, you can see a shift of these Chinese communities towards China, because wages have gone up in China. In Russia, wages are going down. I'm actually following up on this point in the Far East. You need to be patient. Let's see what will happen in 2049, what will be left of Russia. Hopefully by then we'll still be sitting here talking, and we'll see how far China will reach until then. Now I'd like to ask Daniel, this partnership, what does it look like from Moscow? Can you give us the Russian perspective? What do they think over there, especially at the backdrop of the weakening of Russia? Some people are even saying that it is, a vassal, a serf of China. Well, I'll start exactly from this point. All three partners, they don't need to notice. Well, these three partners are all very arrogant and underestimate each other. The Chinese see themselves as the center of the world. The Russians still treat, the Chinese and the Iranians as, being Oriental and not as good as them. So you need to distinguish between the beautiful statements and what's happening behind the scenes and the sentiments represented by them. The Russians really are afraid of China. They are afraid that China will become very strong and will make claims on historic territories from the 16th century, because before that Russia conquered from the Chinese Empire, and they're afraid that they are afraid to create too big of a dependency on Chinese technology. On the other hand, it doesn't have much of a choice, Russia. I mean, if it were Switzerland and if it could choose whether to trade with Germany or France, but it doesn't have a lot of friends, Russia, so it needs to make a choice out of the bad options it had. So what it has is Iran and China, and it'll work with them. Iran is actually more convenient than China. It's easier to exert pressure on it because it's much smaller and it has much more levers on them in comparison to the levers Russia has over China. As for competition mentioned here in Central Asia, the Russians are afraid that China is taking whatever is left of the Russian Empire in this territory. China is a much more significant economic player than Russia, and it's entering the security, the defense sphere. And Russia, in the post-Soviet strategic environment in the Middle East, is a much more active actor. Assaf said that China is keeping silent, but actually Russia isn't. It's more active. It's willing to take more significant risk, to storm, to be some kind of a lightning catcher for the other actors. And in order to create an alternative, a strategic alternative for countries in the Middle East. And for example, Russia wants to develop ties with the strategic enemies of Iran, Turkey, Gulf countries, and Saudi Arabia. And this relationship creates tensions. We and Russia as well, that's a good example, Israel and Russia. In order to advance its interests in Syria, Russia needs to balance between 5 or 6 actors constantly and not partner with only one of them. So part of the Russian strategic rationale is to be this kind of mediator, middleman that gets some kind of a commission, a benefit from all the actors it's working with. And as now the Iranians, on the national memory is very anti-Russian in Iran. There's no one else that did more harm throughout history to Iran than Russia. China also took some Iranian territories. It conquered it 3 times during the 20th century. And on the popular level, wherever there is too big of a Russian embrace, it leads to protests, even in conservative media outlets in Iran. So there are so many conflicting interests here. But just like Russia, Iran doesn't have that many choices. Once that Russia and Iran position themselves as anti-Western actors, then they need to collaborate with each other. They don't have many other better options. As for this alliance, it's not that the British-French-Russian alliance in World War I or the Soviet-American-British-French alliance in World War II. It's not that these alliances were free of tensions. So these actors know how to work very well in coordination wherever is more important to them, and to compartmentalize between the different issues. And, on the one hand, so you don't need to look at it in a very simplistic way, as if they'll be together come hell or high water. Just there's a certain Chinese expression that says that as well. But on the other side, there are so many areas in which the interests are very powerful, and they'll work together around these anchors, and it will be difficult to separate them. Jonathan, a question to you. How can the U.S. break apart this partnership? How can it play on the conflicting interests, and how can it maybe take at least the Chinese out of this partnership? Because I think that to break apart the partnership between the Iranian and the Russians, that's almost impossible at this stage. So how is this viewed in Washington? Is it even possible?
United States history. The United States, remember, they're often surrounded by the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, and their advantage has always been for the last 250 years that they aren't embroiled in a Eurasian mass where there are conflicting countries butting up against each other, and always one is coming up and the other is coming down, and there's always conflict. The United States has tended to stay over there and let them fight it out. And then after the war, the United States comes, everybody realizes they need the United States to have a post-war order. That's what happened after World War I, sort of, and it definitely happened after World War II, the post-World War II order. So when you say what the U.S. should do to break it up actively, I don't think the U.S. can break up things, unilaterally anymore. It should play to its own strengths and let these other countries, let these tensions come to. You talked about the tensions between Russia and China, and certainly the tensions between Iran and Russia. They'll come to the fore. Let them burn each other out, and the U.S. can be there to help. That's the way I see the U.S. role. I don't see the U.S. as the policeman anymore. Having said that, though, I do think that the Ukraine war is a big wake-up call for the use of hard power. That is, Putin has told the world, look, you can all focus on climate change and other things, but right now, hard power is important. Now, some countries never forgot hard power. I think this country has never forgotten hard power because of the neighborhood it's in. But I think Germany and many of the other Europeans have been living in this post-civilization fantasy that their war is a thing of the past, and I think they're having a wake-up call. Why do I say all this? Because I think the U.S. can help the Europeans through NATO. The joining of Finland and Sweden to NATO is a big boost. It can help them bring back into the vocabulary hard power and the importance of good weapon systems, integrated weapon systems, the importance of competing with the Chinese and the Russian military threats, and now the Iranian military threats. I think that's the good news, and that's where the United States can exploit. I'm not an energy expert, but I will also say that both the U.S. and the Israelis are in reasonably good energy positions right now to deal with this crisis of Russian energy stoppages. Germany is not. I was doing a study for the Pentagon called The Future of Europe in 2011 to 2013, and I was struck by the decision of Merkel's government to get out of the nuclear energy business because of what happened in Japan, and I thought it just didn't make sense then, and now we see why it doesn't make sense. So I think that this is a really not only a wake-up call about the need for Germany and other European countries to build up their defenses, but also to revamp their whole energy policies. I myself, I live in London. I'm not sure how I'm going to get through the winter with the energy shortages and the energy prices. But yeah, so I'll come to Israel more often. Saturday was a pretty nice day. But seriously, I think what the United States can do is let me just say one thing about the midterm election. I spent the month of October in the U.S. trying to figure out just how divided the U.S. was and how it was going to impact on foreign policy. While it is true that in the United States, nothing foreign policy-wise gets much attention these days. Even the Ukraine war is not dominant in the headlines as it is in the UK, for instance. But I must say that the expectation of Trump and his people, his deniers of the legitimacy of the 2020 election, to do well in the midterms was rather misplaced, that the United States is not going off the deep end. They're not going extreme. I come from Ohio, which is a very stable state, and even though an acolyte of Trump won the Senate race, he won only because the governor won by more. The United States is going to be around. The declinists are wrong. The economy continues to roll. And I think that we should look at this thing a little bit, this Ukraine war, a little bit more strategically, and again see that what we're seeing in the Ukraine war again is Russian weakness, and whatever weakens Russia weakens its allies, and Iran and China are its allies. So I think the United States is the net beneficiary of this turn of events.
Assaf, you wanted to say something? Yes, regarding hard power. We can see the learning processes of the world that are looking at Ukraine and are thinking about East Asia or Indo-Pacific. You can see it in the armament of countries like Japan and alliances like AUKUS with Australia, Britain, and the US. And in general, in East Asia, there's a significant rise in armament because the understanding that the story of hard power did not end in Europe, and there's a connection, at least by association, between Russia and China and its implications. And there were a lot of comparisons, some of them very problematic. Okay, Ukraine now, so after that, Taiwan. I don't think that this is necessarily implied. And another thing that was very interesting to see how Europe was processing the lessons from the Ukraine. That's a speech of the German foreign minister who said our dependence on Russian oil should teach us something about dependency, and the desired conclusion is that we should examine carefully our dependency on China. It's not just energy, we're talking about supply chains and goods, etc. And this means that at least some of the West is beginning to understand the concepts of power in other countries. China is definitely there. It is all about how to create dependency, how to maintain it, and how to avoid it. And we, last year, and Kevin Lin is sitting here, we published a paper he wrote about the relations between China and Iran. And we saw something very interesting. That is that China was very much involved in reducing its own dependency on Iran. It went down on its dependency on Iranian oil to just a few percentage points. It diversified its sources. And at the same time, she became the trade partner that is in charge of approximately 50% of Iranian trade. When you have these kind of levers and you have taken hold of such large portions of another country's economy or supply chains, you can say, look, I have a few issues. They're not that important to you, but they're very important to me. One, China, the issue of Taiwan in general, Xinjiang, just don't interfere. There are a few things we need to agree on so that we can continue doing business together, and maybe even to make these links, these correlations. If you don't interfere with my communications, I won't interfere with your automotive industry. Iran for many years has been looking to the West and seeing sanctions, and for many years they've been saying that their solution will be found in the East. It looks pretty good until they reach a situation that we hear, and Kevin wrote about it in his paper, that there are people in Iran who are not that pleased with the Chinese takeover over certain sections of its domestic economy. So it's a very complicated relationship. It's never only economy, only technology, only military. These things are always somehow connected to a broad spectrum of means of power and strategy. In a nutshell, dependency is a very important topic. And everybody's now learning from this example of the issue, the behavior of Russia in Europe. And people now realize that they need to be weaned of this dependency. And the U.S., on the other hand, is demonstrated time and again the dominance of the currency and its ability to say advanced chips from a certain level and beyond. They won't go to China. And the machines manufacturing them, dependency of China on chips from the the West. That's very important. And in this respect, it explains how come Iran won't have enough chips, how come China doesn't have, and how come this is going to be one of the most significant things in this world struggle. Now I'd like to address the topic that should be a source of concern for us in Israel, and that's definitely the nuclear cooperation between Russia and Iran that could even turn into Russian assistance for the further development of the Iranian nuclear program. And it seems that these relations of dependency between Russia and Iran can ask and perhaps even demand because of the Russian failures in the battlefield in the Ukraine. And this relationship is very dangerous, at least for us. And we need to, of course, pay attention to that. Could you maybe elaborate on that? Can you hear me? Okay, so if you would have asked me a year ago, I would have said that in the nuclear context, then Russia is one of the most responsible actors, and it was a significant actor behind the formulation of the nuclear agreement. In their rationale, it was, as little the minimum worse it could be in order, and also in the past decade when Iran was looking for all kinds of returns from Russia as part of the nuclear agreement, but it didn't get from Russia the most problematic elements that could have truly contributed to its nuclear program. And if we are going further back, and this was mentioned in the previous panel, these Russian professors who would give talks for $50 in Iran. Well, the nuclear archives that Israel has shows that there were various experts from Ukrainian origins or from Russia, people who had the technology, people who could bring on significant damage. And Russia, I guess, also supplied the blueprint of the nuclear plant at Iraq. So Russia is perhaps a weak superpower, but it is not weak all across the board. There are certain areas in which it could cause damage.
If you see an nuclear Iran now, I don't think that Russia would want it either, because it's a problematic player, and Russia is seeing it too. It's also competing on clout with it in the Middle East. And on the other hand, Iran is also a Russian customer in civil nuclear. They built the reactor in Bushehr. They're building two more. It's involved in various aspects of the nuclear deal. So there is a great interface in the Russian nuclear in Iran. And therefore, if an Iranian player wants a certain kind of technology, they know who to call, because it's the same Russia that builds reactors and also enriches uranium and provides warheads. But Iran still owes hundreds of millions to Iran for the reactor in Bushehr. That's true. So there is a question mark here as for what is happening in the last few months, and is it a dramatic change in relations. But I think that Russia, on the formal level, will not give Iran nuclear capabilities or a nuclear bomb. But if you're talking about dual use, things that can be used for civilian use or can be explained, then yes, perhaps will Russian scientists, technologists, and their capabilities, if they don't have a very good situation, then maybe they will be willing to go to Iran, and perhaps they will be willing to go get a job in Iran. And Iran can certainly gain insight and knowledge at a relatively cheap price. And the same is true for other technological areas. Perhaps Russia doesn't have this kind of munitions that are cheap, but it has many other things that they can supply Iran, like air defense systems and fighter jets. And I think that Russia can certainly enter into collaboration on the military level with Iran when it comes to an enterprise that is together, that is shared, Russian technology going to Iran, and maybe a factory together. Russia can manufacture missiles together with Iran, maybe a submarine. Russia does other things. It has other players that are important So maybe we can think that perhaps Iran, as part of this relationship, can also demand more, and there are things that could be a problem for Israel. The Ukrainians have discovered all kinds of components in the drones, American components, European components, Japanese components. If they will want to build a factory in Russia and to commercially manufacture these drones, the question is, will the United States be able to build a kind of oversight mechanism so that these components will not be passed to Russia through Iran? Because there is an element there. The sanctions imposed on Iran currently do not exactly apply to these specific components that Iran is importing a certain way. These sanctions do apply to Russia, but Iran can certainly be a kind of corridor to import these components into Russia and then build drones there. And the question is, can the United States really prevent, or can it really build a mechanism that will stop these components from being brought there, and in that way to prevent the manufacturing of these drones in Russia?
Berusia.
So anyway, the second part of questions, you asked the big question, how does Israel look at this emerging axis, which is a big problem, of which I give a lot of thought to it since I've been coming to Israel since 1966. So I think about Israel's security problems. But you asked a very specific question, so let me deal with that first. You're alluding to the Wall Street Journal article, which came out just about a week ago, which amazingly said all these parts in the drones that the Iranians are making come from other countries, Western countries. I believe there was something involving an Israeli company even in that article, but who knows?
Who knows?
The point is that yes, the United States can do more. Can it stop? No, but it can do more to pinpoint sanctions, especially now that Iran is not just about Iran sanctions now. It's about Russia sanctions. It's about Iran doing things to help the Russians defeat Ukraine, which is, as you heard in the first panel, anathema to the Biden administration. The Biden administration putting its main efforts in preventing Russia from defeating Ukraine. So anything that helps Russia, and the Iranians are certainly beginning to help Russia, will get much more scrutiny. So yes, I think by definition, the United States is going to tighten up the sanctions on those drone components revealed in that article, and it will also start to strengthen sanctions just on the Iranian drone capability, because it's not only a menace to the Ukrainians, it's a menace all over the world. It's just they're proliferating. The Iranians are proliferating these drone factories all over the place. So somebody's got to try to stop the supply of the components. And I think if we've seen supply chain problems in other areas, maybe there could be a supply chain shortage in making drones if the United States and others put some effort into it.
Assaf, בבקשה.
From an overall perspective in the Iranian issue, we must remember that Iran is a simultaneous problem. It has a nuclear threat and a missile threat and a cruise missile threat and a drone threat, and it's also involved regionally and is subversive. So the main approach internationally, and particularly the Western approach, is one step at a time, one problem at a time. And in WikiLeaks, Omar Sliman said, may he rest in peace, that we don't have the privilege of addressing Iran one problem at a time. It needs to be simultaneous. So when we ask what's most important, nuclear. So you only address nuclear. But then when the JCPOA is passed, then now the exporting embargo will no longer be valid, prohibiting Iran from exporting and manufacturing arms. And then suddenly the West is not really adjusting the structure of the solution to the structure of the problem. The solution cannot be one thing at a time when the problem is simultaneous. We have to address everything at the same time, even if the nuclear part is the most important. And as for the Israeli perspective, for the rest of the world, the problem is Russia and China, not even in this order. For Europe, it's Russia. For the rest of the world, it's China. For the United States, certainly China is the number one problem. But when you ask Israel, what are you worried about? And we talk about the Iranians and the Palestinians, and the others are looking at the list and they're thinking, what? They're so low on our list. So when you ask how can you bring Israel and people from the West to discuss their number one priorities, their number one threats with the United States, it's China and Iran. That's the axis you should focus on. China and Iran, yes, that's the axis that the United States find as a top priority. And for Europe, it's probably Russia and Iran. That's in terms of Israel, a way of bringing Iran higher up on the others' priorities, even if it's not in terms of nuclear. And there is a wide range of issues to be discussed because there are technological partnerships at play and military ones, and everyone is having multi-axis area denial, which is quite similar to one another. And there's a lot to be done on the military level, on the intelligence level, the economic level. So it's a problem that's actually presenting the solution for us and actually outlines the partnerships for us. That's a very important remark in terms of what Israel should do and how it can bring Iran back to the agenda. And I think that we should certainly take these steps in this direction. And this is a fundamental situation because for Israel, China is not a military threat, it's not an adversary, and even in terms of security, it's not a matter of defense, only security. So that creates a misalignment with what others see, especially for the United States, which views it as an entire spectrum. Very briefly, we only have a few minutes. Daniel, please. Yes, I want to say about what Assaf said. I think some say that Israel is actually making a profit on the Iranian aspect, because I do think that there is something dramatic happening between Russia and Iran that is making it a significant threat, and that is a good example. And of course Israel is feeling it, but there is a development happening that is very problematic, which is actually helping us in terms of our public diplomacy, but I don't think we're exaggerating. And as for what you've asked, Jonathan, about these components, I think that there is a global problem here, because Russia doesn't have to buy components directly. It can buy themselves, itself, it can buy through South Korea, Belarus, Kazakhstan. It doesn't only have to be an agreement. So we're going into contracts and complex proliferation networks, and Israel on its own cannot monitor this. We need to build coalitions that will monitor these levels of technologies. Sometimes it's components, sometimes it's knowledge, sometimes it's production lines. And as for Israel's way of dealing with it, well, Israel, people are criticizing it on its position on Russia and on its position on China. Israel is in a complex situation because of our geographic location. And just as Assaf has noted, as China weakens when Russia weakens, so Israel, if its room for maneuvering with these players will be reduced, many more players, and Israel is working with other dictatorships that are players around the world, and everyone looks at what Israel is doing. And that's why its relations with Russia and China will also impact on the relations with Israel and how others look at it in the Middle East and elsewhere. Jonathan, please, go ahead.
I think the time's up, but maybe what I could just say from Israel's point of view, I think it's important that we are asking the right questions. Because if you don't ask the right question, if you don't address the right questions, you get the wrong answers. Yes. So rather than scrambling around for answers, I think we should take into account what Assaf and Danny have brilliantly explained and try to deal with one at a time the questions. And I think the world is starting to wake up to the real question. I mentioned hard power, and I think that's good news. But this is going to be a long fight. By the way, I think it's right that Israel should be more worried about Iran than about Russia and China, because Russia and China, to my mind, do not threaten the existence of Israel. And as long as there's a country out there that does, it's a real problem for Israel. I think the rest of the world's beginning to understand it. The good news for Israel is that now Europe and the United States understand that we not only have shared values with Israel, but we have shared interests.
There is still a lot more to cover, but the time is up. Thank you very much. It was extremely interesting. We'll now